Hello, this is Frank Gaffney. I am the Vice Chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and very pleased to be able to present, in brief, a presentation by one of the best pollsters in the United States. His name is John McLaughlin. His company, McLaughlin and Associates, recently conducted a national survey of likely voters for the Committee on the Present Danger, China, aimed at evaluating what these voters know about the various threats that Communist China increasingly poses to our country and, well, to its own people as well as others around the world. And when they are given even fairly limited information about some of the things that China is up to, what would their response be in terms of the nature of the threat, how they consider it personally, and what they would like to see those who are responsible for their security do about it. We are pleased to have John McLaughlin here with us for the purposes of going through very quickly a slide deck that gives you, the audience, an opportunity to view the questions that were asked and to get some of the, well, top line, as they call it, numbers as to how people responded to the question, but also a sense of the various demographic subcategories as they were broken out by John in a way that I will ask him to describe as it relates to past elections, specifically the 2016 presidential election. Our purpose here today is very simple. We believe that this data simply reinforces what we have long believed, namely that the threat from Communist China is serious, that as Americans learn about it, they will want to know what their leaders think about it and what they will, more importantly, do about it. Particularly those who wish to be our next commander-in-chief, for whom, irrespective of who it may be, their party affiliation, their political philosophy, China is going to be job one. Certainly in the national security space, I'm quite certain in the economic space, and almost certainly, if the coronavirus to date is any guide, in the public health space as well. John McLaughlin, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to walk us through this really important poll, and I'm very interested in sort of your, speaking of top line takeaway from it, for starters.
The important part about this poll is you have 1,000 likely voters who we interviewed from January 27th through the 30th. So these are people that are going to be coming out this November, Americans coming out this November, and the poll has an accuracy of plus or minus 3%. A lot of these numbers are well outside that margin of error. But as far as China and American attitudes towards China, this is a bit of a sleeper issue as we face the November election. So what you have here is situations where a lot of Americans aren't aware of things or aren't thinking about of things that China does. But when they do, the vast majority of them say that they're concerned about it and frankly worried about some of the things that they're doing. So while they see China as an economic competitor now, I mean, where 49% told us that China was an economic competitor, there is a growing number of Americans who would see it as an adversary, where 18%, or an enemy, 8%. We asked them, are you aware that China's leader has declared that the country will become the world's dominant power? 53% of Americans are aware of that. And would they be worried if China were to become the world's dominant power? 66% of all voters said that they would be worried. 77% of Republicans, 77% of conservatives, but also the majority would have 6 in 10 Democrats and 6 in 10 independents would be worried if China were to become the world's dominant power. And when following that train of thought, when you say, are you aware that China's engaged in trade practices that have hollowed out a number of U.S. manufacturing industries and transferred many American jobs to China? 71% of all Americans say that they're aware of that. So that they know. Only 19% are in denial on that. But then when you ask them, one of China's practices is through the transfer of business secrets and other intellectual property, whether by theft, through cyber hacking, spying, or by forcing American companies to seek to sell their products in China to give up such information. Are you aware that the U.S. government estimates the value of such transfers is between $500 and $600 billion a year? Only 39% of all voters say that they're aware of that. So there's something where 46% said no, another 16% didn't know, but only 4 in 10 American voters are aware of that issue. And when you tell them that this practice has enabled China to manufacture and field many weapon systems as part of their enormous military buildup without having to pay the cost and time and money that we incur for research and development, does it concern you that we are in this fashion subsidizing China's acquisition of weaponry intended to be used against us? 74%, 3 in 4 Americans are concerned about that. And then similarly, when you tell them that, as an example, the Chinese military has built up what they call the underground Great Wall. It involves 3,000 miles of hardened underground tunnels, roughly the width of the continental United States, in which China is believed to be hiding large and growing number of nuclear missiles. Do you believe we should be concerned by this immense underground Great Wall and what it suggests about China's ambitions? 75% of all Americans are.
Well, one of the things that, again, is striking about this, if you look at the sidebar there, that is a very strong response, and it's the case in each of these subcategories of the voters that you've polled.
Right. It's 81% among Republicans, it's 70% among Democrats, 73% among independents. It goes across the board.
Those are strong majorities, not just you know, a little bit one way or the other. Okay, so this is this leads into the question about space, and what did you find in that regard?
When we asked them, are they aware that China is seeking to become dominant in space for military as well as commercial purposes? 41% said yes. Only 4 out of 10 Americans are aware of that. And again, it really doesn't matter by party. It's roughly 4 in 10 Republicans, 4 in 10 Democrats, independents, etc. Women, it's only 3 in 10. So when you tell them that, you know, are you aware that everything from our banking system to our cell phones and their navigation software to our power grid depend critically on space-based satellites and communications? 74% of all voters are aware of that. So we know that we need space to function in the world today. And when you ask them, would you be worried if China controlled space? 81% said yes. So this is where they're no longer an adversary, but they're a threat. And again, that's across the board. You have 87% of Republicans, 76% among Democrats. And it goes across every age group, and gender is about the same. So Americans would be greatly worried if China were to overtake us in space.
There's something called 5G, and you were asked a question about that. What's that about, and what kind of results did you get there?
Right. China's trying to get the world to adopt its version of the 5th generation. So it's not just China, but it's you see it around the world. They're trying to get other countries to, whether it's Huawei or their system, they're trying to get them to adopt the Chinese 5G wireless technology. And Americans, we think that's going to be a threat to our country and our allies, as well as to the privacy and safety of the users. So China's lead 5G company says it's not the case. When we ask Americans, are you concerned about us relying on Chinese wireless technology? 70% say they are. And again, that's, you know, 2/3 among liberals, 66%, 2/3 among moderates, 67%, conservatives, 78%. So again, it goes across the ideological spectrum. It goes across by education, by age. So Americans would be greatly concerned.
This is a major public policy issue, as you know, and the administration is figuring out what to do. They've got the American people strongly behind them. Let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. Can you give us a little description of what that's about?
Right. The Belt and Road, where the question was phrased as we asked the respondents, in addition to its bid to get everyone to use its 5G systems, China is working hard to have nations all over the planet to rely on infrastructure like airports, train, and road networks and ports that the PRC, being China, offers to build on credit. Beijing calls it the Belt and Road Initiative, where the targeted countries often find they can't pay for the loans and the Chinese wind up taking over the infrastructure. And in this way, the PRC is building up a colonial empire in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Do you think we should be worried about China having such a dominant position globally? 75% of all of Americans, when they responded to this question, said that yes, we should be worried. And it's across every region of the country, politically 80% among Republicans, 69% among Democrats, 76% among independents. If they have no college degree, it's 72%. If they have a college degree, it's 78%. I mean, this is broad. I mean, the concerns and worries about China and their ambitions is significant among American voters.
And then you drill down on one particular aspect of this sort of larger posture that the Chinese have gotten us into. Talk about this prescription drug business.
Well, 6 out of 10 of the voters say they use prescription drugs. And when we asked them if they know where they're manufactured, only 23% said yes. So 60% said no. So Americans, we trust our pharmaceutical system and we trust the federal and state governments that regulate these drugs. And they use prescription drugs, and most of them don't know where they're coming from. So when we said, are you aware that China now manufactures virtually all of our generic drug components all of our generic drugs, components of other prescription medicines, and penicillin? Only 23% said yes. So 3/4 of all American voters don't know that China's manufacturing virtually all of our generic drugs, a lot of the other components of prescription medicines, and penicillin. So, and again, there's no significant segment of voters has any awareness of this. Then we asked them, if our nation were highly dependent on Chinese supplies of medicines, would you be worried that they might be unsafe and possibly harmful, or possibly harmfully so? 69% said yes. So you've got 7 out of 10 Americans, now that they know this, they're then worried about it. And when we asked them, if our nation were highly dependent on Chinese supplies of medicines, would you be worried that supplies might be interrupted? 76% of all voters said yes. And again, that goes across all the age groups. And by the way, senior citizens, 85%. So the older voters that are more dependent on these drugs, absolutely more concerned that China might decide to interrupt the drugs they need to live. Now, when we asked them, do you think our nation should be highly dependent on Chinese supplies of drugs? Only 11% said yes. And 83% said no. These are big numbers and well outside the poll's margin of error.
And my sense is that, John, this poll reinforces sort of anecdotal experience when we talk with people from the Committee on the Present Danger, China's point of view about this dependency. We almost invariably find this is personal. This is not sort of an abstract thing like national security. This matters, as you've said. 6 out of 10 of us, according to this data, are taking prescription drugs of some kind or another. I'm sure if the question were asked, are you or anybody in your household doing it, the number would be even higher than that. And what people are saying here is they recognize this is a very serious problem and want it addressed, I think, by their elected leaders. John, one of the issues that you also polled on, speaking of drugs, is something called fentanyl. This is a highly deadly drug, and what was your line of questioning like on that?
Well, that's a drug that the vast majority of Americans are familiar with, 78%, and it grows across. They're familiar with fentanyl. And when we ask them, are you aware that fentanyl use kills roughly 70,000 Americans every year? 2/3 of Americans, 63%, sadly said yes. And it certainly, didn't have any difference between men or women or race or, age. So people are aware of this deadly drug. They're aware it kills a lot of Americans in a year. But when you ask them about the next question, we said, are you aware that China produces and smuggles it into the United States virtually all the fentanyl used in this country? Only 28% said yes. So there's a drug that's dangerous and it's smuggled into the U.S. and it's killing tens of thousands of Americans. And most Americans have no idea where it's coming from. And when you look at the fact that the vast majority of the people that said no, it's every region of the country, even college graduates, 2/3 don't know. So it's something that that they need to be made aware of. And then when you ask them, the Chinese government knows about the manufacture of fentanyl in their country and its illegal shipments here. It has repeatedly promised to shut such activities down, but has not done so. Some would call this behavior deliberate chemical warfare against our country. When we asked the voters, do they agree? 59% said yes. So they really, you're going from perceptions about China where they're not aware of certain things, but when they get aware, they're worried, they're concerned. Here's one where they actually believe that this is an act of warfare against the United States, that they would actually allow this drug to be manufactured and smuggled into the United States.
John, there's another topic that I think you went into in some detail, and I think very helpfully so, and that is, how does the Chinese government conduct itself with respect to its own people? I mean, we talk about drugs and other things that they are oriented towards ours, which are clearly problematic and worrying to American voters. But how about what they're doing to people in China?
We asked the question about Chinese government has developed an array of advanced technology, including millions of surveillance cameras, facial recognition software, data mining, and artificial intelligence that allow it to monitor virtually every aspect of its people's lives. It has begun employing these technologies to give everybody a social credit score. If you behave in ways the Chinese government likes, you get a higher score. If you don't, you get a lower one and can be punished for it, allowing the government to exercise unprecedented control over its people. Have you heard about this Chinese social credit system? Only 3 in 10 Americans, 31%, have heard of it. And it goes up a bit with the younger voters, where 18 to 29 years old is 38%, 30 to 40 is 39%, and it goes down the older that they are. But younger voters who are tuned into the technology issues seem to be more aware, and that includes independents at 38%. And this is important because this is what China's doing, and now you've got things in the United States where people are proposing to allow law enforcement to use facial recognition. And you've got this artificial intelligence where people are complaining about the tech giants like Amazon or Google, basically selling you things on what they know. Well, the Chinese government gives you a social credit score where they rate you, and it'll affect you and follow you through your life in their system, where they can say that you're a danger to society, or they could reward you for being a good, loyal communist.
This can translate into everything from not being able to get, an airplane ticket, to getting your kids into schools, to your own job, and even food. Who knows? I mean, these are Orwellian techniques. And so the question was asked about, what about the importation of this kind of technology or social credit system to the United States? What did you find out there?
85% of all Americans would be worried. And Americans, we did watch the news where the protests happened in Hong Kong, and people knew that those Hong Kong protesters weren't wearing masks because of a flu outbreak then. They knew it because the government had cameras on them. And I think the vast majority of Americans, and it goes really across the board. And when you look at, now the senior citizens, 89% would be worried, and it's over 80% with virtually every segment. So we don't even trust our democratic government with this. We asked, do you think it'd be good if the Chinese exported such a system to other countries? Only 13% said yes. 77% said no. So it's clear that Americans across the board don't want this to be an export that the United States gets from China.
And one of the really horrific applications of it is going after people of faith. What was the question there?
Now, the next question we asked, the U.S. government believes that the Chinese government is using social credit system technologies to monitor, persecute, and in some cases imprison people of faith in China, including Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong followers, and Muslims. By some estimates, between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims are being held in concentration camps. Do you find such behavior acceptable? Only 12% of Americans said yes. 81% said no. So people don't think this is a good idea, and it's overwhelmingly going to be rejected in American society.
So here's the key question, and I was so appreciative that this was one that you really developed in some detail as well. How does this kind of technology get brought to bear in communist China for the oppression of people of faith, for the control and repression of hundreds of millions of other Chinese as well?
Well, you brought up the case. We asked the question about the example of the suppliers of the technology, where we said one of the major suppliers of technology underpinning China's social credit system is the Chinese company called Hikvision. The U.S. government has made it illegal to do business with Hikvision because of its critical contributions to the abuse of human rights. Would it surprise you to learn that Americans can nonetheless still invest in Hikvision and that millions are doing so? 39% of Americans are actually surprised by that, but 46% are not. So what they do is we say, no, this is not good, and we're going to ban these abuses or try to, we're criticizing Hikvision because of it, but we still allow Americans to invest in it.
Then you asked about, whether individuals in the survey were themselves investing in the stock and capital markets of the United States. What did you find there?
Well, we have 4 in 10 Americans, 42% say they invest in stocks or bonds, or directly or through a pension program. So that's across the board. And it tends to be more middle-aged, 30 to 40-year-olds, 44%, 41 to 55, 51%. And it tends to be more men than women, 47 to 38%. But it's a good chunk of Americans are invested. And if you do invest, we asked them in our stock or bond markets, do you know whether you're investing in a Chinese company? And only 33% said yes, 40% said no. So you've got people saying they don't know if they're, 25% weren't even sure. So only a third of Americans know whether they're investing in Chinese companies or not. And so there's a lot of information they're not getting. And when we asked them whether you personally invest in stock or bond markets, either directly through a pension program, do you think Chinese companies that build social credit technologies should be able to raise money from American investors? Only 15% said yes. So there's lots of ethical reasons to invest or not invest in companies. There's people, they're doing things based on whether it's green or whether it's not green. They're doing it based on whether they have human rights abuses or not. But here's the case where, if they know that what China is doing with the social credit technologies, the vast majority of Americans don't think they should be able to raise money from American investors, because 69% said no. Across the board. Should Chinese companies that build weapon systems be used against Americans, may is the word, be allowed to raise money on our stock or bond markets? Only 10% said yes. 79% said no. So it's Americans get that.
John, one of the other pieces of this, which is directly relevant to a pending public policy issue and decision, is whether those military personnel, whether they're active duty or they're retirees who have money in something called the Thrift savings plan, it's the federal government's pension plan, would be obliged basically to invest in Chinese companies that might support, their totalitarian social credit system, or even build weapons with which they themselves might be, targeted. Give us a read on that question, would you?
Well, 78% oppose it, and 64% strongly oppose it, because they say that when they're told that American military personnel may soon be compelled to invest in the retirement fund of Chinese companies that build weapons that may be used against them, do you support or oppose? It's not just oppose 3 out of 4, but it's 2/3 strongly oppose. So they see the foolishness of that kind of policy.
This is so important, and I really appreciate this data, because I think that elected officials, many of whose money their own money is involved in this same decision. Civilians as well as military personnel need to know how strongly the American people feel against this kind of use of their retirement funds.
And Americans get it where we do say in the next question, some experts believe that China could not pay for its dramatic military buildup, expansion overseas, and repression at home if it weren't able to raise money in the U.S. stock and bond markets. Do you think the Chinese government and its companies should be able to raise money in our stock and bond markets? 14% said yes, 68% said no. So it's a big no, and it's across the board. And Republicans are stronger, 72%, but Democrats is 63% and independents is 70%. And we're entering into a presidential race where you've got Bernie Sanders, who's a socialist, coming out doing pretty well. But waiting in the wings is you have Mike Bloomberg. And Mike Bloomberg's businesses and his investments totally intertwined with China. And you already saw what the Chinese conflicts of interest as well as Ukrainian conflicts of interest did to Joe Biden. I mean, he's the collateral damage of the impeachment Ukraine scandal, but his family's dealings with China and the things where Hunter was making profits off of their investments from China, it certainly played to bring him down so that he ended in fourth place. He's not the front runner for the Democrat Party anymore.
I think it had something to do with this, for sure. So when you look at this, again, as a public policy issue, John, one of the things that has really been extraordinary is the discovery that not only are hundreds of billions of dollars of Americans' investment money in our capital markets migrating to China to support companies that are doing horrible things to the Chinese people or to others, they don't seem to be playing by the same rules as American companies. Talk us through what you found in that regard.
Well, that one, because the key thing, Americans, when you ask about what they need to do to clean up the swamp over here, they'll tell you one of the first things is transparency, just to get out the facts and the truth. And when we ask the question, some experts note that Chinese companies do not have to comply with the same transparency rules that American ones do with respect to accountability, good governance, and risk disclosure. Should Chinese companies have to satisfy the same requirements as American companies do if they want to raise money in our stock and bond markets? 72% of all voters said yes. So that's a big number, and it's across the board, and that goes whether you're a liberal, whether you're moderate, whether you're conservative, Republican, Democrat, independent. You think 7 out of 10 voters, we think they ought to be transparent.
It only seems reasonable that we've got standards for our companies, and they're in our capital markets. They should conform to those same standards, and yet they don't at the moment. That has to be fixed. John, finally, you asked questions about how these voters felt about their presidential candidate choices as they relate to their attitudes on China. What were those questions about?
This is why I said it's a sleeper issue this year, because it won't be a sleeper much longer or if something happens, that world events take its course. But when we asked, should the presidential candidates make clear their positions on the sorts of questions I've asked you, 85% said yes. And that's across everybody. They want to know where their candidates stand on these issues that face the United States and China. And when we ask them more or less likely to vote for a presidential candidate who did not agree with you on your views on China, 58% said less likely. And that one, it was 62 with Republicans, but also 51 with Democrats. So the vast majority of Americans, we will not only say that, we need to know your views, but if we disagree with your views on China, we're probably going to vote against you.
Yeah. And how important would those views be in the overall calculation about supporting a candidate, John?
6 in 10 voters say it's important. So again, this is not a fad. This is a serious issue that voters have strong beliefs on, and they really have concerns and apprehension over China as far as not just economic issues, but also on national security issues.
Now, the argument is often made by people who have, let's be honest, basically gotten us into this fix, that if we just keep doing business with the Chinese, it's going to come out okay. They will be friendly, or they will be less threatening for sure. You tested this question with the voters. What did you find on that score, John?
They disagree. 57% oppose that view, and 27% strongly oppose that view. But they don't believe that just by doing business with them, China's going to change their ways. And we've seen that. I mean, Donald Trump proved that when the president did phase one of the trade deal. I mean, we've been dealing with them for a long time, and they've been taking our jobs, they've been taking our capital, taking our technology, and to be frank, voters that don't trust them, they would, so they would be apprehensive about that. And when we ask them, do you support or oppose a candidate who believes we must not continue doing business with Chinese in ways that harm our industries, make us dependent on China, and underwrite their military and hostile behavior? 2/3 of the voters said they support that candidate. So it's these are strong feelings.
Yeah, strong feelings, and that's with a bare modicum of insight into really how serious these problems are. John, it seems to me that what you've done here is establish sort of a baseline. I can tell you that we at the Committee on the Present Danger of China are determined to try to further increase in the days ahead over these next critical months of the 2020 election season, not as a partisan matter, but as a public policy issue. What Americans are known about, what they are informed about, what they are educated about, what they are going to be making decisions about in terms of China, the threat that it poses, and the candidates' chances of doing something that will satisfy their concerns that you've demonstrated here very amply. That's going to be job one for us, just as I think job one for the next president is going to be China. John McLaughlin, thank you for this very, very instructive poll. Thank you for all that you do for our country and making our decisions in these election seasons and otherwise more informed and better. God bless you, sir. We'll talk with you again soon. Thanks to all of you for listening. We'll talk with you in the near future as well about more work at the Committee on the Present Danger of China. You can read all about it, this poll, and much, much more terrific videos and other resources at presentdangerchina.org. Thanks for listening.